I'm Haley, and here soon you'll be hearing from Jen, who is also with Mid-Atlantic TAB and is based at the University of Delaware. A little bit about Mid-Atlantic TAB. We are the technical assistance provider for EPA Region 3, which includes Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Washington, D.C. We'll talk more about the resources and services we offer later in the presentation, but one of those resources that we offer is Brownfield Education, an example of which is today's webinar. Also contributing to this presentation are Tony and Dawn with EPA Region 3, and Melissa and Sandra with the Delaware Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control. If you missed our first webinar in this series, you can check out the slides and recording for more details about each Brownfield grant application, including threshold, narrative, meeting requirements, and eligible activities. Finally, here's an overview of what is to come. You're going to learn about EPA Brownfields grants and eligibility requirements, SAM.gov and application threshold criteria, FY26 MARC grant changes, grant packages, key information, and more information about TAB resources, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. With that, I'll go ahead and turn things over to Jen.
Great. Thanks, Haley. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. I'm just going to go over some high-level criteria for the grant before letting Dawn and Tony dive into some of the deeper details. So, grant overview, in terms of these EPA Brownfields grants, we typically have the multi-purpose assessment, revolving loan funds, and cleanup. Therefore, they become called the MARC grants. This year, we only have the MAC grants because the revolving loan funds are not available for this round, but we'll probably be back for another round in the future. Next slide, please. Okay, a little bit about the grant timeline. And so I think why all of you are here, of course, is that these grants are due January 28th of 2026. So with the holidays in between, it's going to come around pretty quickly. But once those grants are submitted, the flow kind of goes like this. There are some threshold eligibility review. That's kind of the first things that we'll go through of whether the application meets the kind of basic criteria. And if it doesn't meet it, you actually will find out fairly quickly in February or March whether the application meets those actual requirements to even be submitted. And so after that, those that pass that first sniff test will go to the national review. And this is all the EPA project officers from all of the regions across the country review the grants and do a scoring and ranking. That ranking that happens in March and April. And then later in the spring, in May, those results go to the EPA Office of Brownfields and Land Revitalization for that final selection. And then the moment everybody's waiting for, it will happen in June when the selected applications are announced publicly. Next slide. Okay, so who's eligible for the grants? Kind of first things first. Obviously, state and local and all tribal governments are eligible for these, as well as any kind of component unit of a government, quasi-governmental agencies, redevelopment agencies, those types of things that are sanctioned by the state are also eligible, as well as nonprofit organizations. And when we say nonprofit organizations, we're really talking about those 501c3s. 501c4s, especially those that lobby, are not eligible. And so if you're kind of not sure where you fall on that spectrum, please reach out to either somebody at TAB or check the eligibility, the fine print on those eligibility options to make sure that you're good before diving ahead. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm not going to read this slide to you. There's a lot of information on here, but basically it's looking at the different grant types, which again, we have the three different types, the multi-purpose, and then there's three different types of assessment grants, the community-wide assessment, assessment coalitions, and then assessment grants that are specific to states and tribes. And then we also have the cleanup grants. It provides the maximum project period that the work that is written into the grant needs to be completed within. And for most of them, as you can see, it's 4 years, though with the exception of multipurpose and the state assessment grants have a 5-year period. Again, maximum amounts that are allowed per grant, as well as the estimated awards that fall into each of those categories. I will just point out, so the cleanup grants have two different buckets. One are considered for the smaller projects, and they have a maximum of 500,000. Then there's the larger projects, the larger cleanup grants that will go up to 4 million. And so this is the last year where there's no cost share. And so we've got the Infrastructure and Investment and Jobs Act money that's providing funding for about $197 million, as well as the appropriate allocation there, as you can see, of about 58.7 million. Next slide, please. Okay, so another question we often get is, can I apply for multiple grants, right? A lot of people involved in brownfields, there's multiple sites that they're looking at, multiple projects that they're looking at. Can you apply for multiple applications? And in short, if you find the primary one that you're applying for on the left and then scroll across, if you fall in the green, absolutely you can. For the most part, if you are applying just for an assessment grant, you are eligible to apply for a cleanup grant and vice versa. Multi-purpose grants kind of cover all of the aspects of the grant, so there's not really a need to apply for multiple ones. But again, I'll look for those green boxes, and you are eligible to keep going. And then the next question that we get on the next slide is really about if you already have a current EPA Brownfields grant, because a lot of times this is a continuous long-term process, right? And so you want to keep moving along. Again, the answer primarily is yes. You can see all the green boxes. The yellow ones is basically if you have an existing grant, you need to have drawn down 70% of the award amount before you are allowed to apply for the next type of grant. Except for the blues really only apply to the state and tribal community assessment grants. And so the other thing I do want to point out on this slide is that bottom right-hand corner where you can apply for, if you have an existing cleanup grant, you can apply for another cleanup grant, but it has to be for another site. Specifically, not 2 cleanup grants for the same site. And next slide. Okay, I want to get into this is kind of the first steps before whether you've decided to apply for the grant or not. SAM.gov is something that you need to take care of before you go off on that holiday break to enjoy all the fun time with family and friends. Go ahead, Haley, to the first slide. So SAM.gov is the system for awards management with the federal government, and any entity that does business with them has to have what's called a UEI, or a unique entity identifier, registered with the government. And so this is the website that you go to kind of start that process if you haven't done it before, or if you have but need to check on the status of it or the contact information, make sure all of that is up to date. Again, this is where you want to go. Next slide. Right, and so just to kind of clarify, the grant comes out on grants.gov, and that's where you'll submit. But as part of that submission, again, you'll need that UEI that is from sam.gov. Next slide. And just again, as I said, so the changes to sam.gov can take 2 weeks, can take longer than that. And so that's why that's one of the first things I want you to do when you get off this call is really make sure that your SAM.gov and your UEI are up to date. You want to make sure that you have the correct contact person listed on that, and not, your organization applied years ago, but that person's not there anymore. You want to make sure that that gets updated. It is free to register, and you do need to renew that registration every 12 months. And so again, if it was done last year, but that ends January 1st, the January 28th deadline would knock you into that period where you need to have renewed it. And so just go in and check it, make sure it's all taken care of so you have a little bit of that peace of mind. Next slide. And I'm going to hand this over to Tony to really dive into those criteria highlights and some of the changes for the upcoming year.
Thanks, Jennifer. We're going to talk about the first part of your application, arguably the most important. You can go on to the next slide. The threshold criteria, as Jennifer mentioned, is the first part that will be reviewed to determine if you can move on to the next level of review. Before I get into this, a quick procurement warning. Keep in mind if a contractor reaches out to you and says, I will prepare your grant application as long as I can work on the grant project if you're awarded. That's a no-no. Basically, the QEP, the Qualified Environmental Professional, can't prepare an application and be awarded the contract to work on the grant unless they go through the competitive bid process. So this process, if you are awarded a grant, requires putting out a request for proposals or requests for qualifications, and you would then be reviewing any bids that are received to choose your contractor on the grant. So just keep that in mind as you're preparing your application. Next slide. So threshold criteria for all grants. These criteria ensure that you are eligible to receive a grant, and these are pass-fail criteria. So this is the first thing we're going to review to determine if the rest of your application can be reviewed, the narrative criteria. So it's important that you're answering every threshold criteria response that is requested in the application guidelines. And that's section 5A of your grant solicitation. So pay careful attention to all the items that are requested. Double check your work. If you feel like one of the criterion doesn't apply to you, I would recommend keep that header in your application and just write an A, not applicable underneath. That just makes us aware that you did indeed review all of the threshold criteria and you weren't just leaving certain things blank. If for some reason the applicant's deemed ineligible as a result of failing the threshold review, you will be notified within 15 calendar days. So again, we're expecting to make these determinations by mid-March, so you would know by end of March whether you failed threshold criteria. Next slide. So for all grants, assessment and multi-purpose grant applications require a current letter from the state agency, which in Delaware is DNREC. That just basically acknowledges that you're planning to apply for the Brownfield grant and conduct Brownfields activities. If you have applied in the past, just please note that last year's letter or previous year's letters are not permitted. You will still need a current new letter from the state. For cleanup grants, these letters are a little more involved. You would acknowledge that, same as the other grants, that you're applying for the grant, but then there's also a site characterization portion. So the state needs to determine that a sufficient level of characterization has been performed or that additional assessment is needed. And if so, then the applicant must confirm that that additional assessment would be done by June 15th, 2026. So just a few extra bullets that should be included if you're applying for a cleanup grant. And this would also require a phase 2 environmental assessment to be completed on the site or equivalent. So that an equivalent to a phase 2 might be something like an asbestos survey. In DNREC or in Delaware, you have site-specific assessments that might include elements that a phase 2 would include. Mine scarred land. I don't believe we're dealing with any of that in Delaware. So, but that's another type of phase 2 equivalent is a mine land report. So next slide. All right. So for cleanup grants, you're also required to own the site by the time that the application is submitted. So ownership in its most basic form would be the fee simple title through a legal document. And in addition, prior to acquiring the property, you must have conducted all appropriate inquiries. So that's basically having a phase 1 environmental site assessment completed prior to the property being transferred. And also note phase one environmental site assessments have a shelf life. So if you had one done a year before, a year ago, that does not count. You'd still need an updated phase one within 180 days of acquiring the property. And the owner must not be liable in any way for contamination at the site or affiliated with anyone who's potentially liable for the contamination. Next slide. So threshold criteria for cleanup grants continued. You will also be required to hold a public meeting and notify the community that the application is going to be submitted. At the public meeting, EPA is asking that the draft application is discussed, public comments are considered. This meeting can be part of another regularly scheduled community meeting. It can be in person or virtual. We do recommend keeping virtual or hybrid as an option in the case of inclement weather and things like that. It's always helpful. And then you'll want to review some of the attachments on the grant application at the public meeting, which include an analysis of brownfields cleanup alternatives, which we'll get into. And you'll need to show in the application a copy of the advertisement of the meeting. That could be a newspaper clipping, a screenshot of a website, the comments, a summary of the comments received and your responses to the comments, and any other meeting notes and sign-in sheets. So these are all basically pieces of evidence that the meeting occurred that need to be attached to the application. Next slide. Continuing on this, the ad for the public meeting must be posted no later than 2 weeks before. So in our case, with the application deadline of January 28th, the deadline to advertise the public meeting is January 14th. So keep that date in mind. We certainly encourage you to try to advertise and hold the meeting sooner, just to allow enough time to let the community give feedback and also to compile the materials that you will need to attach to the application. This ad does have some specific points that it needs to hit. It needs to state that a copy of the grant application is available. Let the community know how they can comment on the draft application, where it's located, and of course, when the public meeting will be held. Next slide. And Tab has prepared some wonderful infographics. These are sort of cheat sheets on things you need, information you'll need to include in your grant application. There's one for cleanup grants. You can see here, and you can go to the next slide. One for assessment grants as well. So this is just kind of an easy way to make sure you're not missing anything. I would recommend, especially for the cleanup grants, using these tools because it is so in-depth, all the things that need to be attached. So do please follow the links and check out these infographics. Next slide. Okay, and here I'm going to hand it over to Dawn to talk about some of the changes in this year's competition.
Thanks, Tony. So yes, we're going to talk about the changes for the fiscal year 26 MAC grants. And again, as we noted before, RLF grants are not included in this particular solicitation. It is the multi-purpose assessment and cleanup. Next slide, please. The best source to figure out all of the changes from last year's guidelines and this year's guidelines are going to be at the link that's provided on this slide. We're going to talk about some of those changes, but this is not a comprehensive list. So please go check that link once you receive this slide deck, and that will have all of the changes that have occurred between the two fiscal years. Okay, next slide. So these first things apply to all of the grants that have guidelines posted. The new Notice of Funding Opportunities, or if you hear me say NOFO, that's what I'm talking about, which provides the guidance, is a little bit more streamlined this time around. So the format's a little bit different from previous years. It's something you're going to take a look at, make sure that you understand kind of what the reorganization looks like. So information's been rearranged into a couple of different sections. I think they've simplified the outline and the format a little bit more, which I appreciate. Make sure you review the updated language and requirements that align with current priorities. And also for all grants but cleanup grants, there's information on how nonprofit organizations exempt from taxation under 501c4 may be eligible to apply. There's also a sample format for the budget table provided in the guidelines, so that can be helpful as you're developing your budget for your grant application. Next slide, please. These are specific to assessment grants. These are the changes. Next slide. For community-wide assessment grants, those charts that Jen talked about at the very beginning were the eligibility charts, and those discussed a little bit of if you have a current grant, what grants you are eligible to apply for. So in this example, for community-wide assessment grants, if you already have a community-wide assessment grant for states and tribes or a pending award, you must meet a drawdown requirement of 60% of each CWAG Street grant that you have to apply for a new one. Current assessment and multi-purpose grant recipients that want to apply for CWAG Street funding must have met a 70% drawdown. So again, review those eligibility charts. They're super helpful in understanding if you have a grant and want to apply for another grant, if you're eligible or what you need to do to be eligible. In both of those cases, you will have had to meet that drawdown requirement by October 1st of 2025 to apply for a fiscal year 26 grant. And then we also have a summary of the percentage and point distribution for different portions of the narrative related to your application. So keep that in mind as you're going through and working through the application, that you're focusing on those areas, especially the ones that are going to result in more of a point benefit when you spend time in those for your grant application. And again, we have that link again, just as reference for the complete list of changes. Next slide, please. For assessment coalition grants this year, we have awards available up to $1.5 million. Entities with an open award or pending an award for a community-wide assessment grant for states and tribes, or CWAG Street, which is what I said earlier, are not eligible to apply for funding under this solicitation. There is a little bit of a difference because there were previous limitations on entities that were eligible to lead assessment coalition grants that have been removed, so that is good. A list of eligible entities to apply is the same for both lead and non-lead coalition members. So that is a nice change that people were requesting. The current assessment and multi-purpose grant recipients that want to apply for an assessment coalition grant must have met the 70% drawdown requirement by October 1st, 2025. And the coalition target areas may not overlap, and the target areas must be in at least 3 distinct municipalities or jurisdictions. So that's something different for this year. And again, we have that point percentage distribution spread. As you review the guidelines, you can see that spread yourself, and that'll help tell you where you need to make sure that you're focusing so that you get all of the points that you can for your application. Okay, next slide. Now we're going to talk about changes for multi-purpose grants. Okay, so entities with an open award or pending award for a community-wide assessment grant for states and tribes, so the CWAG Street grants, are not eligible to apply for multi-purpose grant funding under the solicitation. Current assessment and multi-purpose grant recipients that want to apply have to meet that 70% drawdown requirement. And again, we have the point percentage distribution. There are a little bit of differences in the maximum number of points you can earn per application, if you've noticed through the previous slides. So make sure you, again, kind of see where those points are coming from and make sure you address all of those criteria. As a reminder to what Tony said earlier relating to threshold criteria, the same applies here, where as you're going through your narrative, if there's information that you don't have access to or there's something that doesn't apply, make sure that you make a note of that you considered it. Maybe you don't have all the information you would like to have for a very tiny community, but you have information for a little bit larger community or the county. Make sure that you said you'd search for that information and this is what was available, so that you're making sure that you note that you attempted to answer all of the questions that are asked. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, cleanup grants is next. Okay, so for cleanup grants, we've already talked about this a little bit. The major change that we have this year is that the state letters are going to say whether you have sufficient assessment to begin remediation at your site, or you don't have sufficient assessment to begin remediation at your site. In the case that you do not have enough assessment or enough site characterization or data to begin that remediation, you need to make a statement as the applicant that a sufficient level of site characterization will be performed by June 15th, 2026. In the past, we didn't have that affirmative statement, but in this round, that is required. And so that's in addition to that letter. So the letter will have some of that information. And then as the applicant, you may need to provide additional information if you need to do additional assessment. Okay, next slide, please. In addition, in that letter, the letter from the state will indicate whether or not your site is enrolled or intends to enroll in a state voluntary response program. So if you're eligible, in some cases, there are some sites that will be remediated that are not eligible for the program. And in that case, you'll have a little bit of a different letter from the state. But if your site is eligible to enroll, then the state will indicate whether or not you are enrolled or are intending to enroll. And please note that your grant budget can include funds that will pay for costs to enroll you in those programs. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so current multi-purpose grant recipients that want to apply for cleanup grant funding must meet that 70% drawdown requirement. Again, that was by October 1st, 2025 to apply. And similar to the previous application information, we have the point and percentage distribution for each of the sections that you'll be providing information on in your narrative. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to pause here and see if anyone has any questions so far about any of the material we've covered. I don't know, Becca, if people should put those questions in the chat or how we want to manage those.
Yeah, feel free to put those in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand and unmute, we could do that.
And you can always type them in the chat throughout the presentation, and we can address those at the end. Or if someone can weigh in the chat on those questions, they can also do that. So any questions right now for any of our presenters so far? Okay, awesome. Well, then I am going to hand off to Melissa Leckie from DNREC.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to talk about a little bit about the grant package and the letter that you will need from us. So next slide. When applying for the grants, there will be a narrative information sheet that's required. This sheet will need the following items included on it: the applicant's identification, the name and full address, the website of the entity applying, the funding requested, the grant type, and the federal fund amount requested, and then the location. We will also need the target area and priority site information, so for site-specific assessments and cleanups only, and then contacts for the grant, and then population of your jurisdiction or the targeted areas. And then under each grant, there's some other factors, checklists in the grant application. So you want to make sure you look at those and make sure they're entered in on that letter as well. And then you will need the letter from us here at DNREC. And please note that copies of applications submitted will be made public on the EPA's website. So if there's anything that's confidential or trade secret, please make sure you're aware of that when submitting the application. Next slide, please. So for the narrative and ranking criteria, all narratives must be single-spaced. Nothing exceeding the page limit will be reviewed. For the cleanup/assessment grants, it's a 10-page limit, and the multi-purpose grant is a 12-page limit. The narrative, which includes responses to the ranking criteria, must provide sufficient detail to allow for an evaluation of the merits of the application. So it should include the project description and plan for revitalization, the community needs and community engagement, task descriptions, cost estimates, and measuring progress, and also programmatic capability and past performance. The threshold criteria responses and any other factors and considerations you are trying to include. And then another note is that the EPA only evaluates the information that's requested and required on the NOFA or the notice of. the notice. And therefore, they do not encourage applicants to solicit support letters from members of Congress or include them with the applications. Next slide, please. Now we're going to talk about the letter that is required for the state for your grant package. Next slide. So to be eligible for a cleanup grant, if it's eligible to enter a brownfield program, it has to meet the following qualifications. The applicant must affirmatively demonstrate that they did not cause or contribute to the release. The applicant must be in full compliance with all environmental requirements in Delaware. They must not be a chronic violator, and they must not be in any current enforcement action with a state or federal environmental agency. If they to not be eligible for the to not be eligible for the brownfield program, the applicant can't be a responsible party. The applicant is not in compliance with all environmental requirements in Delaware. They're a chronic violator, or they're in a current enforcement action. Next slide, please. So we must review any assessment results if you're applying for a grant. So the state letter must affirm eligibility for the site to be entered into the Delaware Brownfield program. The letter must also affirm that the site either has a sufficient level of site characterization to begin remediation or will require additional assessment/site characterization to begin remediation. And for sites not eligible for the Brownfield program that maybe just rely on asbestos or something else, an environmental professional must certify that a sufficient level of site characterization has been performed in order to begin remediation or that additional assessment needs to be completed. And please submit your request to myself as soon as possible so we have time to review the assessment data. Next slide, please. And so for the letter from DNREC, we required attachments for all grants. It's a required attachment and acknowledges that we're aware of the support for the project and support the project. Site characteristic levels from the environmental site assessment. One letter can be used for multiple applications if you're applying for multiple grants, and the letter must be from this current year. The contact for the state letter is myself, Melissa Leckie, at delaware.gov is my email, and you should at least request the letter at least 2 weeks prior to grant submission so I have time to get the letter prepared. And I think that's about it for me. Next slide, please. Yes, I'm going to pass it back over to Tab.
All right. Thanks, Melissa. Okay, so almost there. We've got a couple more slides to go through, and these are really some more of the tips and tricks. So next slide, please. Obviously, there's a lot of federal forms that go along with the application, and so I'm not going to go through them specifically, but just there is sample federal forms that you can look at if you click the link on the slide. Once you receive the slides, that will help you walk through them. Obviously you can always reach out to any of us for assistance with this, or especially your tab providers. But if you're looking at it in the middle of the night and you I just want to pull up, like, what are they exactly do they mean here? You can go to this file and look at different sample slides and forms, as well as some tips and tricks that go along with that. So next slide, please. For those of you who have unsuccessfully applied in the past and are trying again, just remember to refer back to the grant debrief that you had with your EPA officer or with TAB. That has some things have changed slightly, but there's always some great strategies that you receive during those times to help strengthen it on the next round. Next slide. And again, if you have questions, and you aren't the first one with those questions, I'm sure we have put together a great FAQ list that, again, you can get to through the link on the slide once you receive them. Again, this is another resource for when you can't reach out immediately to someone, and that most likely what you're thinking of has been asked before, and we've kind of consolidated those into this resource. So next slide, which I think is just another break for questions. I'll just give another section. Anybody, if you want, again, put your hand up or can put a question in the chat. Wait just a sec. And if not, again, we'll just go on to the next slide, which is a little bit more, I think we said in the beginning, Mid-Atlantic tab is here. Obviously, next slide, we do provide and host webinars such as this with our EPA and state partners. We also can help with you in the writing of the grant. And so looking at projects, looking at budgets, we can do grant review. And so if you send it to us, either UD or our WVU who's the lead for Region 3, we'll do several different, at least two of us will be able to review the grant depending on the amount of time and provide you some comments. We help with local brownfield support and actually concept design and development through our partners. And all of the tab resources are free to communities looking to redevelop your brownfields. Next slide. Okay. Again, just a picture for local governments within the state of Delaware, we do offer some additional grant writing assistance beyond what TAB is permitted to do. So feel free to reach out specifically on that if you have questions. Next slide. Okay, deadlines. Actually, sorry, the poll is right in the middle of my deadline. So there we go. January 16th is the deadline, as I said, to submit it to TAB for any kind of review to receive. And that gives you time to get our comments and then be able to address them. January 14th is the deadline to submit a letter to Melissa and to DNREC in order to get that letter to submit with your grant package. And January 28th, again, is the deadline to submit your grant through grants.gov. Okay, next slide. State contacts. And so again, everybody who has been on the webinar today can, whether it's and the specific questions that they can help with. Tony and Dawn really help answer questions to those criteria questions. Melissa and Sandra can help with the agency letter and the grant application. And then next slide, TAB, myself, and the whole TAB team, which there are, as you can see pictured here, we've got quite a team. Any of the other things, we will do our best to, if we can't answer them directly, reach out to find out somebody who does know the answer and get back to you. So, and next, and all kinds of ways that you can reach TAB and find us. So.